A Roman official sits in a shaded courtyard, dipping a stiff reed brush into dark pigment. He drags the ink across a piece of whitewashed wood. They perfected it to maximize public erasure. To understand the true mechanism of the Roman cross, we have to look at the architecture of the ancient world that interrupted God's plan. The humiliation was the mechanism of victory. God was deliberately entering the deepest point of human degradation to dismantle it from the inside out. But this creates another question. Why would God choose a piece of wood? If the goal was simply to die for humanity, there were dozens of other ways to accomplish it. Why choose an instrument that specifically represented a divine curse? The clue is not found in the Roman legal code. It is buried centuries earlier, in the ancient laws of Moses. To understand the profound theology of the cross, we must leave the paved Roman road and enter the ancient wilderness, long before the Roman Empire existed. The Israelites were moving through the arid, unforgiving landscape of the Sinai Peninsula. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses delivers a sweeping code of ancient law to a nation preparing to enter a new land. Tucked inside these civil and religious laws is a very specific instruction regarding capital punishment. If a man committed a crime punishable by death, and his body was hung on a tree as a public warning, Moses gave a strict boundary. The body had to be taken down and buried before sunset. And then Moses added a phrase that would echo through history: "For a hanged man is cursed by God." The empire prided itself on the Pax Romana, the legendary Roman peace that allowed trade, art, and philosophy to flourish across the Mediterranean. To the ancient Israelite, a body suspended on wood was not just a symbol of civic justice. It was a picture of ultimate spiritual contamination. The person hanging between heaven and earth was considered completely severed from the blessing of God. They were physically and spiritually expelled from the community. Up to this point, our question has been primarily historical. We have seen how Rome used the cross as an instrument of political erasure and psychological terror. But the New Testament writers invite us to look much deeper. When they look at the Roman cross, they do not just see a piece of imperial timber. They see the ancient tree of Deuteronomy. The Apostle Paul makes this connection explicit in his letter to the Galatians. He writes, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" This is the midpoint where the stakes of the story escalate dramatically. This is no longer just a story about surviving the Roman Empire. This is a story about repairing the cosmos. Jesus is not merely suffering a political execution. He is willingly absorbing the ancient, cosmic curse of a broken humanity. Step back and look at the architectural pattern woven throughout Scripture. The biblical story begins with a catastrophic rebellion involving a tree. But this piece was an illusion. It was not maintained by mutual goodwill or political agreement. It was maintained by calculated and overwhelming terror. In the Garden of Eden, humanity reached out to the wood of the tree to declare their absolute independence from God. That single decision fractured human nature and brought a curse upon the physical earth. A curse that the book of Genesis specifically notes would produce thorns and thistles thousands of years later. The pattern returns, perfectly inverted. Jesus is marched to a place of public execution. Pressed into his scalp is a crown twisted entirely from thorns, the literal, physical manifestation of the Genesis curse. He is then nailed to a rough piece of wood. The tree in Eden was the place where humanity tried to elevate themselves to become like God, bringing death into the world. The tree of Calvary is the place where God humbled himself to become human, absorbing that death into himself. The place of humanity's original rebellion becomes the exact site of its redemption. This changes how we must read the crucifixion. Jesus is not an unlucky peasant caught in the gears of a corrupt political system. He is intentionally stepping into the epicenter of the Deuteronomy curse. He is taking the full, crushing weight of human shame, rebellion, and separation from God upon his own shoulders. This theological architecture is breathtaking. Once the pattern becomes visible, the entire story reads differently. But we must remember that on Friday afternoon, no one standing in the dirt outside Jerusalem and crucifixion was the central pillar of that terror. Because of this, crucifixions were never hidden away on distant hills. They were thrust into the center, saw a beautiful theological pattern. They saw blood, flies, and a catastrophic defeat. They saw the unstoppable Roman war machine crushing another Jewish hope into the dust. And nowhere is that violent collision of divine purpose and imperial power more obvious than in the final, quiet conversation between Jesus and the Roman governor. The stone floor of the Praetorium is cold. It is early morning. And Pontius Pilate, a man who commands legions, stands face to face with a battered, exhausted rabbi from Galilee. It should be a wildly uneven contest. Rome possesses the absolute power of life, death, and crucifixion. Jesus possesses nothing but the torn clothes on his back. Yet, as the Gospel of John records the trial, the atmosphere in the room is completely inverted. The prisoner is entirely calm. The governor is increasingly terrified. Pilate tries to assert his authority. He demands answers, trying to uncover a political rebellion. Jesus simply replies, "My kingdom is not of this world." Frustrated by the prisoner's quiet confidence, Pilate finally draws his ultimate weapon, the threat of the wood. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" he asks. "Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus looks at the representative of the most powerful empire of public life. Crosses were erected at major crossroads, along busy imperial highways, and directly outside the busiest gates of the city, on earth, and strips away his illusion of control. "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." Ultimately, Pilate is trapped. The religious leaders manipulate him by questioning his political loyalty to Caesar. To save his own career, Pilate sentences an innocent man to the supplicium servile. But he is furious at being cornered by his own subjects. As an act of petty, political revenge, he dictates the exact wording for the whitewashed board we saw in the opening courtyard. He orders the titulus to read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests immediately see the insult. They rush back to the governor and demand a revision. "Do not write, 'the King of the Jews,' but rather, 'This man said, I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate, having finally found a way to wound their pride, refuses to change a single stroke of ink. "What I have written, I have written." Notice what is happening here. Rome operates purely on dominance and intimidation. Pilate uses the titulus to humiliate the Jewish nation, essentially saying, "Look closely. Here is your king beaten, bleeding, and destroyed by Rome." He orders the sign painted in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. It is written in the language of the local religion. Even more surprisingly, the victims were rarely suspended high in the air. The wooden upright beams were often short, leaving the feet of the condemned, the language of the imperial government, and the language of international culture. It is designed to be read by everyone, passing through the crossroads of the world. But in attempting to mock Jesus, Rome accidentally publishes the absolute truth. The empire that designed the cross to permanently erase a man's identity unwittingly creates a global decree of his kingship. The titulus, meant to broadcast his failure, becomes a royal proclamation. Without realizing it, Pilate turns the ultimate instrument of Roman shame into the billboard that announces the true king to the nations. Rome thought they were writing the end of the story. They believed the cross would silence the carpenter forever. But this historical irony raises a deeply personal question. Up to this point, we have looked at the cross as an ancient event. We have examined Roman laws, Greek words, and imperial politics. But the New Testament refuses to let us stay safely in the past. It demands we look at the cross as a mirror. The Roman cross was a physical reality in the 1st century. But shame is a universal reality in every century. We do not live under the threat of imperial crucifixion, but we are intimately familiar with the fear of exposure, just 1 or 2 feet off the ground. The Romans wanted the suffering to be intimate. As you walked into Jerusalem to sell your grain, From the moment we are old enough to understand the expectations of the world around us, we begin building defenses. We carefully curate our public image. We hide our failures, our addictions, our broken relationships, and our deepest insecurities. We construct thick emotional walls because we are terrified of what would happen if the people around us actually saw the truth. Like the condemned men of the ancient world, we carry our own invisible titulus. It is the internal record of every time we fell short. It is the label that whispers our guilt in the quiet hours of the night. Failure, fraud, unwanted, broken. We spend massive amounts of energy trying to outrun that board, hoping that no one will ever read it. We mistakenly believe that if our true selves were ever dragged into the light and exposed to the public eye, we would be utterly unlovable. We would be cast out of the community. This is why the specific nature of Christ's death is so devastatingly personal. When we reduce the cross merely to a transaction, a cold legal payment for moral mistakes, we miss the profound emotional depth of what Jesus accomplished. The question is not just whether God can forgive your sins. The deeper question is whether God can heal your shame. Or, as you traveled along the bustling roads of Judea, you were forced to share the same physical space as the dying. If Jesus had simply died a private, honorable death by the Roman sword, it might have satisfied a legal requirement for human rebellion, but it would not have touched the deepest, darkest parts of human suffering. To reach us in our most profound isolation, he had to enter the exact place we are most afraid of. He had to be exposed. When Jesus is stripped of his garments and suspended on the wood, he is not just absorbing physical pain, he is willingly entering the absolute center of human disgrace. He takes the mockery, the staring eyes, the vulnerability, and the complete loss of reputation, and he wraps it around himself. He allows the world to hurl its worst condemnation at him, and he does not hide his face. This is not ultimately a story about the devastating power of the Roman Empire. It is a story about the subversive power of a God who enters our deepest shame to destroy it from the inside out. Jesus was publicly stripped and shamed so that you no longer have to hide in fear. He allowed his own identity to be mocked so that your identity could be secured. When the fear of exposure threatens to crush you, you had to look them directly in the eye. You heard the flies. You smelled the sweat, the blood, and the loss of bodily control. The cross stands as a brutal, beautiful reminder that the worst has already been seen, and it has already been absorbed by God himself. When you realize what he actually carried up that hill, your relationship with your own past changes completely. You no longer have to exhaust yourself defending your reputation, because the only opinion that matters has already declared you loved at your absolute worst. You do not have to carry the weight of your own failures, because someone else has already carried them into the dark. But how exactly does this transfer happen? How does a physical execution that occurred 2,000 years ago actively dismantle the invisible record of guilt we carry today? Which brings us to one of the most breathtaking statements in all of Paul's letters. 30 years after the crucifixion, the Apostle Paul sits with a quill in his hand, writing to a community of believers in the city of Colossae. These were people who understood the crushing weight of the Roman legal system. They knew what it meant to owe a debt they could never repay, and they knew the exact mechanism Rome used to enforce its laws. To explain what Jesus accomplished, Paul reaches directly into the terrifying imagery of the imperial execution. In Colossians chapter 2, he writes, "He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. You were close enough to hear their desperate, shallow breathing, and close enough to see the wild scavengers waiting at the base of the wood. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross." To the modern ear, this sounds like standard religious poetry, but to the ancient ear, it was a thunderclap of legal and historical reality. Remember the titulus, the whitewashed board painted by the Roman bureaucrat in our opening scene. By Roman law, that board was a literal record of debt. When a criminal was crucified, their specific violation was written out in black ink. It was the legal justification for their execution. As long as that board hung above their head, The debt to the empire was being paid in blood. Paul takes this horrific image and completely inverts it. He tells us that when Jesus hung on the wood, the physical sign, carved by Pilate, was not the only record present. Theologically, there was another document being nailed to the cross. It was the complete, detailed record of your hidden guilt, every selfish decision, every moral failure, every moment of profound shame, and every secret you are terrified the world might discover all of it, was written on the invisible titulus suspended above the head of Christ. God took the damning evidence of our rebellion, the very record that rightly condemned us, and he placed it entirely on Jesus. But the brilliance of Paul's statement is found in the final action. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. In the ancient world, when a financial or legal debt was fully paid, the creditor would take the parchment containing the charge, casually forming precise, heavy Latin letters. He is not a soldier or a torturer. He is simply a bureaucrat processing the morning's paperwork. The problem is not that we have forgotten how painful crucifixion was. The problem is that we have forgotten how public it was and drive a nail through it, officially canceling the contract. It could never be brought to court again. This is the hidden mechanism of the crucifixion. Rome thought they were nailing a rebellious carpenter to a piece of timber, but God was using their nails to pierce the record of human sin, permanently destroying its power to condemn you. The cross was not just a tragic execution. It was a divine courtroom where the judge stepped down from the bench, took your criminal record, and paid the penalty himself. When the physical life of Jesus ended on Friday afternoon, the legal demands of your guilt ended with him. The debt was not simply overlooked, it was obliterated. This means you no longer have to live on the defensive. When the memory of your past tries to shame you, you do not have to deny what you did. You can recognize what is happening. You can name the failure honestly. But then, you must place it within the larger truth of this passage. You can point to the wood and say, yes, that was my debt, but it has already been nailed to the cross. You cannot be held liable for a charge that has already been canceled. The Roman cross was designed to strip a person of their name and their future. It was the ultimate weapon of an empire that believed it controlled the destiny of the world. But watch what happens when the empire fades away and the dust of history settles. This was the architecture of deterrence. The cross was a gruesome public billboard, advertising the absolute supremacy of the state. Step back and look at the vast, sweeping lens of history. The Roman Empire, with its unstoppable legions, its monumental marble temples, and its unyielding laws, is now nothing more than a collection of museum exhibits. The much-boasted Pax Romana crumbled into the dust of antiquity. The emperors who demanded to be worshipped as gods are buried in ruins. Yet, the brutal instrument they engineered to enforce their eternal rule still stands at the very center of human history. But it does not stand as a weapon of terror. It stands as the ultimate declaration of grace. God did not just defeat Rome. He completely subverted their weapon. We have seen how the cross was designed for three devastating purposes: to inflict total legal erasure, to maximize public humiliation, and to demonstrate the absolute dominance of earthly power. But God compressed those three terrors and perfectly inverted them. He took the instrument of legal erasure and used it to legally cancel our debt. He took the instrument of public humiliation and used it to absorb and destroy human shame. He took the ultimate display of imperial violence and proved that his self-giving love is infinitely more powerful. Think back to that Roman official sitting in the quiet, dusty courtyard at the beginning of our story. He was casually dragging a stiff reed brush across a piece of whitewashed wood, forming heavy Latin letters to create the titulus. The true target of a crucifixion was not the victim bleeding on the wood. The target was the survivor walking past them. He thought he was simply processing the death of a nameless, forgotten rebel from a troublesome province. He assumed that once the sun set on Friday, that wooden board would be tossed into a fire or left to rot in the dirt outside the city gates, its mocking message completely erased by the wind and time. But that piece of wood did not rot in the memory of the world. It was miraculously transformed. Today, the instrument that was specifically designed to terrify travelers and warn them to stay away is planted on the highest architecture of hospitals as a universal symbol of healing. It is worn around the necks of millions, not as a mark of a slave's disgrace, but as an anchor of eternal identity. The cross no longer reads as a warning. It reads as a welcome. And this changes everything for the invisible titulus of guilt and shame you carry today. You no longer have to spend your life terrified of being exposed, carefully managing your reputation to hide your flaws. The God of the universe did not stand safely in the heavens and shout moral demands down to a broken world. He stepped into the dirt, walked outside the city gates, and allowed himself to be completely unmade so that you could be made whole. He took the public shame you feared. The cross was a message designed to burn itself into the psychology of the conquered populations. Do not defy Rome. Do not challenge our order. He took the curse of the ancient tree, and he wore it as a crown. This was never a story about the devastating power of a political empire. It was always a story about a king who weaponized his own vulnerability to defeat the darkness we could not escape. The shame that was supposed to define your life has already been nailed to the wood. The record is permanently canceled. The debt is fully paid, and the cross stands empty. If this journey helped you see the beauty and depth of Scripture more clearly, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this study with someone who might be carrying a heavy burden of their own. Let us continue uncovering the hidden architecture of the Bible together. If you do, we will not just take your life. We will take your humanity. And this is what makes the central claim of the New Testament so deeply contradictory. The cross was a machine designed to provoke absolute terror and deep physical disgust. It was meant to make you look away in shame. Why? Then, did a massive movement of first-century people suddenly choose this ultimate symbol of Roman humiliation as the very center of their faith? If the cross was designed to completely erase a person from history, why did the early Christians make it the most famous emblem in the world? To answer that question, we have to look at who Rome actually selected for this specific punishment. The Roman legal system was a masterpiece of rigorous categorization. Every person living under the shadow of the empire carried a specific legal status. But the board, resting on his knees, the titulus, is the final psychological weapon in the empire's vast arsenal. And that invisible status determined exactly how you were permitted to die. If you were a Roman citizen who committed a capital offense, the law granted you the privilege of the sword. Beheading was a swift strike of steel. It was relatively private, often done behind closed doors. And, most importantly, it was considered honorable. The citizen retained their dignity. Their family name remained intact, and their body was returned for proper mourning. They died as a human being. But crucifixion was an entirely different legal universe. It was never intended for citizens. In the minds and writings of Roman jurists, the cross was known as the supplicium servile, the slave's punishment. It was a mechanism of terror reserved exclusively for the lowest tier of ancient society, rebellious slaves, foreign insurgents, pirates, and the poorest criminals of the provinces. When Spartacus led a slave rebellion a century before Christ, the Roman legions did not just kill the survivors in battle. They lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crosses. It was a visceral, inescapable warning to anyone else who belonged to the lower classes. To understand the true weight of this, we must recognize a specific legal category in ancient Rome known as the infamous. This was not merely a criminal record. In an ancient culture driven entirely by honor and shame, to be declared infames. Within hours, this wooden sign will be hung around a condemned man's neck. As the man is paraded through the crowded, narrow streets of the city, was to be legally stripped of your personhood. You lost the right to vote. You could not testify in a court of law, and you could not defend yourself against accusations. In the eyes of the state, you simply ceased to exist as a person of worth. You were a non-entity. This is exactly what the cross was designed to accomplish. It was the brutal, physical enactment of legal erasure. When a Roman magistrate condemned a man to the wood, he was not simply ordering a physical death. He was declaring an ontological change. He was telling the public, the creature hanging on this wood is no longer one of us. The cross was meant to permanently unmake a person, severing them from their family line, severing them from their community, and violently erasing them from the memory of the living. To be crucified was to be legally and socially annihilated. This historical reality makes the gospel accounts of Jesus' execution utterly subversive. The writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were fully aware of what crucifixion meant in their culture. They knew it was the ultimate social disgrace. If they were inventing a new religion to appeal to respectable Roman or Jewish society, they would have suppressed the details of the cross at all costs. The board will speak for him. It will announce his guilt to the world. It has one devastating purpose: to reduce a human being's entire existence. They would have framed Jesus' death as a noble martyrdom, a peaceful passing by poison like the Greek philosopher Socrates, or a heroic death in battle. Instead, they leaned directly into the absolute degradation of the event. They recorded the trial, the beatings, the rejection by his own people, and the agonizing march to the execution site. But as we read their accounts closely, a startling contradiction emerges. Rome designed the cross to strip away identity and maximize physical pain. Yet, when the gospel writers actually describe the darkest hours of Friday afternoon, they barely mention the physical trauma at all. The blood, the nails, the torn flesh, the visceral elements that modern films focus on so heavily are summarized by the ancient writers in just a few brief, clinical words. We often focus primarily on the physical torture, but the ancient writers were fixated on something else entirely, and they crucified him. Those 4 words are all the Gospel of Mark provides to describe the physical act of the execution. Luke and John are equally brief. There is no lingering description of the heavy hammer, the iron nails, or the torn flesh. If the biblical writers were focused solely on physical suffering, they missed their greatest narrative opportunity: their memories, their family name, and their dignity. To a single, fatal crime. When modern people think of crucifixion, we often imagine it merely as, but the gospel authors understood something that modern readers often overlook. The Romans were not just destroying a body, they were dismantling a reputation. The biblical narrative slows down and expands, not for the bloodshed, but for the social degradation. The text meticulously records the stripping away of Jesus' garments. In the ancient Near East, clothing was a primary marker of identity, status, and honor. To be stripped naked in a public space was the ultimate violation, a deliberate imperial tactic to inflict deep psychological trauma. Beneath the cross, the Roman guards sit casually in the dust, rolling dice to divide his remaining clothes. It is a scene of chilling indifference. The man suspended above them is agonizing for breath. They are simply playing a quiet game for his tunic. Then comes the verbal assault. The writers dedicate significant space to the mockery of the crowd. The sheer volume of the rejection is overwhelming. It comes from every level of society: the imperial soldiers, the religious elite, the common travelers, and the condemned. Passers-by shake their heads, a specific cultural gesture of intense contempt. The religious leaders sneer, challenging him to come down from the wood if he truly holds divine power. Even the criminals suspended beside him join in the derision. And hanging above it all is the titulus, the whitewashed board from the Roman courtyard, sarcastically declaring his royal status to a world that is laughing at his complete helplessness. This is the anatomy of shame, the ancient world's most painful method of execution. We picture 3 tall, clean wooden beams standing on a distant, lonely skyline, respectfully separated from, in a first-century honor and shame culture. Public standing was not just about reputation, it was about your very survival. To lose honor was considered worse than losing wealth, and in many cases, worse than losing life itself. The true agony the Gospels highlight is not merely the asphyxiation or the shattered nerves in his wrists. It is the absolute exposure. It is the willing submission to total vulnerability. Jesus is hanging at eye level, absorbing the venom, the spit, and the mockery of the very humanity he came to rescue. The physical pain would end at sunset. The shame was designed to permanently define his legacy. When we realize this, it creates a massive historical problem. Today, we look back at the cross through 2,000 years of beautiful theology, soaring cathedrals, and polished gold jewelry. But in the first century, the cross was raw, terrifying, and profoundly embarrassing. No one in the ancient world wore a cross as an accessory. It would be like wearing a hangman's noose or an electric chair on a silver chain today, but with the added stigma of ultimate social disgrace. If you wanted to start a global religious movement in antiquity, this was the absolute worst marketing strategy imaginable. How could you ever convince a first-century Roman citizen or a devout Jewish scholar the daily life of the city? We assume that Jesus endured this specific death primarily to experience maximum physical suffering for our sins, to worship a man who died the death of a disgraced, naked slave? You cannot build a kingdom on the shoulders of a publicly humiliated criminal. The answer to this historical impossibility lies in a specific Greek word that the Apostle Paul uses to describe exactly how the ancient world viewed this message. The Apostle Paul was a highly educated scholar, deeply embedded in both Jewish theology and Greco-Roman culture. He knew exactly how absurd his message sounded. When he wrote a letter to the new church in the wealthy, cosmopolitan city of Corinth, he did not try to soften the embarrassment of the crucifixion. Instead, he placed it at the very center of his argument. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he writes a sentence that would have shocked his readers. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. To understand why this message was so repulsive to the ancient ear, we have to look closely at the Greek word Paul uses for stumbling block. The word is scandalon. In modern English, we derive the word scandal from this root, but our English translation has lost the physical edge of the original term. Today, a scandal implies public gossip, a ruined reputation, or moral outrage. But in the first century, a scandalon was a physical object. It originally referred to the trigger stick on a hunter's snare, the piece of wood where the bait was placed, which, when touched, sprang the trap. By Paul's day, the meaning had expanded to describe a heavy stone. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong. The physical agony was indeed unimaginable, but it is incomplete. Rome did not invent crucifixion to maximize pain in the middle of a path. It was a massive obstacle that you could not step over. It was something that caused you to trip, fall flat, and ruin your journey. Paul is saying that the Roman cross is an intellectual and spiritual obstacle that the ancient world simply cannot get past. To the Greeks, the idea of a crucified deity was moria, the root of our modern word moronic. Greek and Roman gods were supposed to be benign, completely insulated from human suffering. They lived in the clouds, wielding thunderbolts, manipulating history, and demanding perfect sacrifices. They were the ultimate expression of power and control. A god who allows himself to be stripped, beaten, and nailed to a piece of wood by corrupt politicians was not just weak, he was pathetic. To the Greek mind, worshipping a crucified victim was absolute foolishness. But to the Jewish mind, it was something far worse. A crucified Messiah was a theological contradiction. The Jewish people were waiting for a conquering king to ride into Jerusalem, break the heavy yoke of the Roman Empire, and establish an eternal throne of justice. A Messiah defeated and humiliated by Rome was, by definition, a false Messiah. The cross was a scandalon, a trap they could not step over. Yet, Paul and the early Christians refused to change the message. They did not preach a sanitized religion, despite the shame of the cross. They preached the cross precisely because the shame was the entire point. They recognized a profound, subversive truth. The humiliation was not a tragic accident.